Mr. President, this is a photograph that was taken today of our President, Donald Trump, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. This photograph was taken in the Oval Office today, where President Trump met with Mr. Lavrov. The meeting was closed to the American press. The photos released by the Kremlin in Moscow. The second photo is of Mr. Trump and the Russian ambassador to the United States. His name is Sergei Kislyak. He was also in the Oval Office today to meet with President Trump. And this picture was also released by Moscow, by the Kremlin. Ambassador Kislyak's name is familiar to many Americans now. It's familiar to me because President Trump's national security advisor, Michael Flynn, resigned because of communications he had with Ambassador Kislyak that he tried to keep secret and misrepresented not only to the American people, but to the Vice President of the United States. The warm smiles and hearty handshakes that President Trump gave to these Russian officials stands in stark contrast to the way that the White House has treated three American Department of Justice officials, Sally Yates, Preet Bharara, and James Comey. After President Trump was elected president, he asked Ms. Yates to serve as acting Attorney General. He asked Mr. Bharara to stay on as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and he indicated that Mr. Comey could stay on as Director of the FBI. But then it appears that each of these three Justice Department officials were in charge of investigations that started to become a concern in President Trump's White House. We heard on Monday from Sally Yates how she had informed the White House counsel's office on January 26th of this year that Michael Flynn, the national security advisor to the President of the United States, had been compromised and could be blackmailed by the Russians for lies that he had said publicly. President Trump kept Michael Flynn on as national security advisor for 18 days after that express warning by the acting Attorney General to the White House counsel. He only asked for his resignation hours after the Washington Post reported on General Flynn's false statements about his Russian communications. The President fired Sally Yates, the acting Attorney General, on January 30th, 4 days after she warned the White House about this connection between General Flynn and this ambassador. And then there was Preet Bharara, who the President invited to Trump Tower to tell him he wanted him to stay on as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Mr. Bharara's jurisdiction, of course, included Trump Tower. The President then, in a sudden Friday evening announcement on March 10th, fired all the United States attorneys, including Mr. Bharara. Mr. Bharara said he was blindsided. Why? We don't know, but we do know that Mr. Bharara was well known as a dogged and independent prosecutor. News reports indicate that Mr. Bharara was investigating one of the President Trump's cabinet members, HHS Secretary Tom Price, for insider trading. And then yesterday, President Trump fired FBI Director Comey while the director was in Los Angeles giving a speech to FBI agents. The director was not told directly of his firing. He thought initially that it was a joke. At the time he was fired, Director Comey had confirmed that the FBI was conducting an investigation into Russia's interference with the 2016 election and possible Russian connections between the Russians and individuals in the Trump campaign and administration. Last night, CNN reported that federal prosecutors have begun a new phase of this Russian investigation, issuing grand jury subpoenas to associates of Michael Flynn, seeking business records. Director Comey was supposed to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee later this week. And according to news reports, Director Comey last week went to the Justice Department and requested more money and resources to devote to the Russian investigation. Sally Yates, Preet Bharara, James Comey, three Justice Department officials who led investigations that appeared to be getting close to the President and his inner circle, all three fired by President Trump. President Trump's firing of Director Comey made history, not since Watergate. On the evening of October 20th, 1973, a Saturday, known affectionately as the Saturday Night Massacre, has a president dismissed the head of an investigation into his own administration. In its 109-year history, only one FBI director had been fired. FBI Director William Sessions was dismissed for serious ethical violations and the FBI at that time was not investigating the Clinton administration. Now, I've had my disagreements with Director Comey, judgments he's made, statements he's made. I'm not exactly his greatest fan, but I didn't question his competence when it came to investigating. I never called on him to be fired. There are so many questions that need to be answered. Why was Director Comey fired now, just as the FBI investigation of the Russian interference in the presidential campaign seemed to be reaching a critical point? Today, White House spokesperson Sarah Huckabee Sanders said that the president has been considering firing Director Comey, quote, since the day he took office. Did the president or anyone else in the White House ask or direct the Justice Department to recommend the firing of Director Comey? Press reports quote Trump administration aides saying Attorney General Jeff Sessions was charged with coming up with the reasons why the president should fire Comey. President Trump told my colleague Senator Feinstein he'd asked the Justice Department to review Comey's performance. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Deputy Press Secretary to the President, acknowledged today that the President asked the Justice Department to put the recommendation in writing. Why was Attorney General Sessions involved in this decision at all? Remember, Attorney General Sessions was forced to recuse himself from the investigation of Russian collusion with the Trump administration because of his close connections with the Trump campaign and communications he himself had with Mr. Kislyak and other Russian officials. When they made the decision to fire Director Comey, was the White House aware that Director Comey had reportedly just asked the Justice Department for more resources for an adequate investigation? And perhaps the most important question of all, when will Republicans in Congress agree to support a special prosecutor and an independent commission to get to the bottom of this Russian collusion in our last presidential election? Mr. President, December 8th, 2016 is a day that will live in cyber infamy. It was that election that the Russians set out to change the results. It's the first time we have seen an overt effort by a foreign power to do this. And many on the other side of the aisle have taken a ho-hum attitude. Oh, it's just another example of kids being kids. I don't think so. When one of our major adversaries in the world decides to try to impact the choice of leader of the free world, the United States should stand up, take notice, and fight back. Let's not forget that this is all happening less than 1 week after a hacking attack on another Democratic election in France, and that all signs point again to Russia as perpetrator. Russia has acted with impunity since its attack on our election, in part due to the administration's refusal to acknowledge Russia's responsibility for an act of cyber war on America and to respond accordingly, and the majority party's refusal to take serious actions here in Congress. President Trump, in these pictures, is shaking hands with Russians, and the Kremlin is gleefully tweeting these pictures around the world. The president kept out the American press, but it turns out that the Russians got the photos they needed to send around the world. The American people need some answers about what's going on here. When will the Republicans join us in a bipartisan effort to have an honest investigation, to follow the facts and follow the evidence wherever it may lead, and to hold those accountable who may have been guilty of collusion with a foreign government trying to impact the outcome of an election? Mr. President, if you read the memo that has been prepared by Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, giving the reasons for the dismissal of James Comey, it focuses almost exclusively on Comey's treatment of Hillary Clinton in the last presidential campaign. I'm incredulous to think that some 10 months after the fact, that the Trump administration took such pity on the treatment of Hillary Clinton, they couldn't wait to fire the director of the FBI. That's the so-called good reason they're giving us. But there's a real reason. The real reason is that that same James Comey was engaged in an investigation of the Russian collusion in the last election. He's looking at members of the Trump administration, specifically General Flynn in this circumstance, and he is also looking at whether any other individuals involved with the Trump campaign or not were engaged in this activity. He clearly needs more resources, and he wants to get to the bottom of it. And for that, he was fired last night. The question, obviously, is what happens next? Will the American people sit still for this? Will they accept this kind of effort to close down an investigation that might reach into the president's own White House? If they are willing to step back and let that happen, then we have surrendered an important principle. In 1973, President Nixon tried to make it clear that he could not be held accountable to the rule of law when it came to the Watergate break-in and cover-up. He fired Archibald Cox. Others resigned because of that firing. And the public sentiment across America was so strong against President Nixon for trying to intervene in this legal process that ultimately he paid a heavy, heavy price for his conduct. I don't know whether there's any involvement of President Trump in this collusion. I'm not going to assume that. I shouldn't. In fairness, there should be an investigation, a credible investigation by professionals. But shutting down the investigation by the FBI at this point closes the door of gaining information, valuable information, so that we understand who was involved in this effort to undermine the American presidential election. I'm not standing here in defense of James Comey as a person. I do stand here in defense of that director of the FBI who believed, as our intelligence agencies believed, that this was a credible threat to the democracy of the United States and deserved a professional prosecutor's investigation. For that reason, Comey and his efforts should continue, but having dismissed him, let's at least hope that Mr. Rosenstein will stand up for the integrity of the Department of Justice and do two things. First, give a public assurance that the investigation of Russian collusion in our last presidential election will continue, and at the time name a Department of Justice career official who will be in charge of it until a new director of the FBI is found. And second, Mr. Rosenstein, as well as Senator Sessions, now Attorney General Sessions, should be party to choosing a special prosecutor. Let us choose someone from outside government without a party label who has demonstrated the expertise necessary to prosecute such challenging situations as this, put them in charge, let them investigate, and let the facts lead us to a conclusion. To try to stop this or short-circuit it by dismissing Mr. Comey is ineffective in terms of serving justice and sadly is a sad reflection on American ideals and values.